Hurricane Irma's surge poses major risk to Florida. Hurricane Irma, the most powerful storm to take aim at Florida in decades, is on a path that presents the worst-case scenario for deadly storm surges and powerful winds when it strikes the state Sunday, threatening millions of homes and businesses. Irma is a massive storm, covering an area more than double the size of Florida, and generating sustained winds of more than 150 miles an hour. It has already killed more than 20 people after flattening the Caribbean islands of St. Martin and Barbuda as it arced north toward Florida. The Category 5 hurricane's impact could reach as far north as Indiana and Illinois, forecasters say, affecting about 50 million people. Long lines of cars clogged Florida's highways after authorities and forecasters implored the state's 20.6 million people to leave low-lying coastal lands expected to be inundated by hurricane-driven seawater. Storm surges, one of the most deadly threats of Hurricane Irma, can rise to 9 feet to 20 feet high, depending on whether the storm hits the peninsula from the Atlantic on the east or the shallower Gulf of Mexico to the west. If it comes in from the Gulf side, Tampa Bay could just get hammered, and that really is one of the big catastrophic events we have been worried about for some time, said Kyle Manley, assistant professor of mathematics at Columbia University. But Mr. Manley warns the entire state could remain at risk if the hurricane tracks up the middle of the state and causes storm surges on both coasts, though those would probably not be as high. With Irma now projected to make landfall in the Florida Keys about daybreak Sunday, weather experts say the flooding could begin hours earlier because surges from a hurricane start to hit land in advance of the storm center. The surge peaks as the hurricane eyewall crosses onto land, said Robert B., professor emeritus at the University of California's Center for Catastrophic Risk Management. We're talking several hours of surge, Mr. B said. Storm surges, created when the high wind of a hurricane forces ocean waters onshore, account for half of the deaths and most of the destruction caused by the majority of hurricanes, weather experts say. Miami-Dade County Mayor Carlos Jimenez cited a possible life-threatening storm surge when he expanded the county's evacuation zone on Thursday, now affecting more 650,000 residents. Much of the estimated $62 billion in U.S. damage from Superstorm Sandy in 2012 was caused by the storm surge that slammed the eastern seaboard, according to an analysis by the U.S. Geological Survey. Storm surge was cited by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration as the major cause of the $75 billion in destruction along the Gulf Coast from 2005's Katrina, which leveled beachfront communities in Mississippi and inundated the city of New Orleans. On Florida's coasts, which will face the brunt of the hurricane's destructive force, about 3.5 million residential and commercial properties are at risk of storm surge damage and almost 8.5 million properties are at risk of wind damage, according to data provider CoreLogic. The last Florida storm that was the size of Hurricane Irma, which intensified into a Category 5 storm late Friday, was Hurricane Andrew in 1992. That storm was originally classified as Category 4 but was reclassified in 2002 to a Category 5. Catastrophe modeling firm Karen Clark and Company said a repeat of Hurricane Andrew on the same path as in 1992 would cause $50 billion in insured losses. The same storm directly hitting Miami today would cause more than $200 billion in losses, the firm said. Miami, however, is protected by a rapid drop offshore thanks to the continental shelf, which is unlike Florida's mostly shallow Gulf of Mexico coast. As a result, the surge hitting Miami is likely to be lower than if it moves along the Gulf Coast, according to NOAA. The highest waves are typically centered on the leading right side of the storm, where counterclockwise winds in the northern hemisphere push the bulk of a hurricane's destructive force. The surge waves are made even higher when they travel across shallow coastal waters, said Robert Bolin, a meteorologist with the Central Pacific Hurricane Center in Honolulu. Historically, the biggest storm surges in U.S. history have taken place in shallow Gulf waters. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 produced the nation's highest recorded surge of 27.8 feet at Pass Christian, Miss. At least 1,500 people died in Katrina, many from the surge, and entire beachfront neighborhoods were washed away by the waves, NOAA officials said. But Irma is forecast to take such an unusual track, essentially up the length of the Sunshine State, that hurricane experts aren't exactly sure how the surge pattern will play out. If it shifts slightly to the west, much higher surge could inundate parts of Florida's Gulf Coast, said Columbia's Mr. Manley. Even a shift of a few kilometers could be the difference between a huge disaster and something more manageable, Mr. Manley said. Damage from a storm surge is considered flooding, which isn't covered by standard homeowners insurance policies. Flood damage is largely covered by the federal government's National Flood Insurance Program, which provides homeowners up to $250,000 to repair a home and $100,000 for personal possessions. Homeowners in high-risk flood zones are required by their mortgage providers to buy flood insurance, but consumers outside those areas often forego the coverage. Businesses can buy federal flood insurance, which covers up to $500,000 for damage to a building and $500,000 for its contents. Commercial property insurance for large businesses often includes flood coverage. Miami could face a major economic loss even with a smaller surge because it has such a high concentration of office buildings and other development near the coast, said Mr. B at the Center for Catastrophic Risk Management in California. Downtown office buildings there are not designed for surge, Mr. B said. With water weighing about 1,700 pounds per cubic yard, NOAA officials say extended pounding by waves could destroy a structure not designed to handle such force. In Miami Beach's South Beach neighborhood, Al Marin said he planned to stay put for Irma, despite a mandatory evacuation order covering Miami Beach and the departure of numerous friends. They all left town. They're afraid, Mr. Marin said. He wasn't concerned about Irma's potent winds, he said. I'm more worried about the storm surge. But not enough to abandon the beach. Another concern is for the possibility of Irma's high winds creating an inland surge on Lake Okeechobee, as happened in a 1928 hurricane when waves caused a large body of water north of Miami to overflow and drown at least 2,500 people in nearby cities. If Okeechobee gets hit with rainfall and intense winds, it can cause another surge there, Mr. B said. Florida has been lowering the water level of Lake Okeechobee in anticipation of the storm, Governor Rick Scott has said. Tropical triple threat. Hurricane Katia strikes Mexico and Jose looms as Irma threatens Florida. Hurricane Irma is not the only show in town. Two other dangerous and strengthening hurricanes, Jose and Katia, are swirling in the Atlantic Ocean basin. Jose, following a similar path to Irma in the eastern Atlantic, has grown into an extremely dangerous Category 4 hurricane with 150 miles per hour winds. On Saturday, it could strike or at least brush some of the same islands in the northern Lesser Antilles decimated by Irma on Tuesday night and Wednesday. Taking Irma and Jose together, this is the first time on record two storms in the tropical Atlantic Ocean have attained 150 miles per hour winds at the same time. Meanwhile, the peak winds of Hurricane Katia, centered over the southwest Gulf of Mexico, had reached 100 miles per hour. It made landfall north of Tequila, Mexico, as a Category 1 hurricane with winds of 75 miles per hour on Friday night. Atlantic currently has 3 Cat 2+ hurricanes at same time, second time on record this has occurred and first time since 1893, tweeted Phil Klodsbach, hurricane expert from Colorado State University. Hurricane Jose. Jose has exceeded all expectations by explosively intensifying into a Category 4 storm, the third straight hurricane in 2017 to do so, following Harvey and Irma. This is the first time on record 3 straight storms have attained a Category 4 or higher status, according to Klodsbach. A hurricane watch was issued for Antigua, Barbuda, Aguila, St. Martin and St. Barthélemy, many of the same islands devastated by Irma on Tuesday night and Wednesday. If the storm tracks over these beleaguered islands, they could face destructive winds for the second time in 4 days and up to 8 inches of rainfall. The exact track of Jose is still somewhat in question, and there is a chance it could escape to the east of the already battered islands. But it's too close to call. After the storm passes the northern Leeward Islands, it will no longer be a threat to land areas curling away from the United States, forecasters predict. Hurricane Katia. Just as Jose was upgraded to a hurricane Wednesday afternoon, So was Katia. This system formed in the western Gulf of Mexico from lingering disturbance earlier this week. Katia made landfall north of Tequila, Mexico, as a Category 1 hurricane with winds of 75 miles per hour late Friday. A hurricane warning was out from Cabo Rojo to Laguna Verde. While a 5 to 7 foot storm surge and damaging winds are likely close to where this hurricane makes landfall, torrential rains will affect a much larger area. Katia is expected to produce total rain accumulations of 10 to 15 inches over northern Veracruz, eastern Hidalgo, and Puebla, the Hurricane Center said. Isolated maximum amounts of 25 inches are possible in northern Veracruz, eastern Hidalgo, Puebla, and San Luis Potosi. This rainfall will likely cause life-threatening flash floods and mudslides, especially in areas of mountainous terrain. 3 hurricanes at the same time is highly unusual. Incredibly, all 3 of the active hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin could affect land at the same time on Saturday: Irma over the Bahamas, and approaching Florida, Jose over the northeastern leewards, and Katia in Mexico. It is quite rare to have 3 simultaneous hurricanes. The last time this occurred was in 2010 with Hurricanes Igor, Julia, and Carl. In an unlikely coincidence, these storms are almost in the same order in position as Irma, Jose, and Katia, and have the same first 3 letters, I, J, K. Forecasters really want you to be scared of Hurricane Irma. Washington: catastrophic, life-threatening, extremely dangerous. Scary? Forecasters hope so. The National Weather Service are using as fearful words as they can, on purpose, to warn people about Hurricane Irma and shock them into action, just as they did last month for Hurricane Harvey. Words like catastrophic, get out, life-threatening, hopefully it will sink in, said National Hurricane Center spokesman and meteorologist Dennis Feltgen. The weather office on the Florida Keys may have done him one better. This is as real as it gets. Nowhere in the Florida Keys will be safe. You still have time to evacuate, the National Weather Service's Florida Keys office tweeted Friday. A year ago, the National Weather Service announced it would stop screaming in all capital letters unless in case of emergency. This is an emergency. The Hurricane Center used all capitals some places, and in other places just kept hinting at death if you don't pay attention. Irma is expected to make landfall in Florida as an extremely dangerous major hurricane, and will bring life-threatening wind impacts to much of the state regardless of the exact track of the center. A Friday posting wrote, "This is a life-threatening situation. Everyone in these areas should take all actions to protect life and property from rising water and follow evacuation instructions from local officials." During Harvey, Feltgen joked he was running out of words to convey how dangerous the storm was. He said the situation was the same with Irma on Friday. "Do I need to bring a thesaurus here and see what I can do with it?" Feltgen said. "This is a storm that will kill you if you don't get out of the way." A spokesman for the National Hurricane Center has released a terrifying warning urging people to evacuate as Florida braces for the monster Hurricane Irma. Meteorologist Dennis Feltgen warned this is a storm that will kill you if you don't get out of the way, as the massive storm hurls towards Florida's coast. Experts expect Irma to make landfall in Florida Keys between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. local time on Sunday, with forecasters saying it could hit the state as a Category 5 hurricane. "Everybody's going to feel this one," said Feltgen. More than 5.6 million people have been asked to evacuate the state, with officials saying that it is now inevitable that Florida will caught in the path of the hurricane. "It's not a question of if Florida is going to be impacted, it's a question of how bad Florida is going to be impacted," said Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency William Brock Long. Irma is armed with 250 km/h winds as it barrels towards Florida's coast, where is it likely to make landfall as a dangerous major hurricane that will bring life-threatening wind impacts to much of the state, according to the National Hurricane Center. Officials are going door-to-door calling on people to evacuate. While parts of Florida and Georgia are under a mandatory order to evacuate, officials are legally unable to forcibly remove anyone from their homes. The death toll stood at 22 and was expected to rise as rescuers reached some of the hardest-hit areas. And a new danger lay on the horizon to the east. Hurricane Jose, a Category 4 storm with 150 km/h, 241 km/h, winds that could punish some of the devastated areas all over again this weekend. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to know that further damage is imminent, said Inspector Frankie Thomas of the Royal Police Force of Antigua and Barbuda. The National Weather Service urged people to flee from the life-threatening storm over Twitter. Florida Governor Rick Scott is warning that residents in South Florida only have hours left to evacuate. Scott on Friday told residents from 7 counties that they should leave by midnight or should not get on the road. If you are planning to leave and do not leave tonight, you will have to ride out this extremely dangerous storm at your own risk, Scott said. U.S. President Donald Trump warned Americans to get out of the way of Irma. Hurricane Irma is of epic proportion, perhaps bigger than we have ever seen. Be safe and get out of its way, if possible. Federal G is ready. Florida Governor Rick Scott said the call to evacuate had become even more dire. We're running out of time. The storm is almost here. If you are in an evacuation zone, you need to go now, he said. This is a catastrophic storm that our state has never seen. We can rebuild your home, but we can't rebuild your life. Hundreds of thousands of Floridians choked highways to race north, crowded airports and emptying supermarket shelves of bottled water and food, and draining petrol supplies to try to escape what authorities described as a nuclear storm. While many were heeding warnings that the entire state faces catastrophic damage, some Aussies were among those considering braving out the approaching hurricane. Hurricane Irma is expected to rip into the state over the weekend. The looming threat of the dangerous storm has triggered a massive evacuation. Those trying to flee have encountered traffic jams and there have been fuel shortages, especially in South Florida. Scott has urged Floridians for days to heed evacuation orders, but he has also told residents they don't need to leave the region, but instead to seek out nearby shelters. Florida's major theme parks are planning to close as Hurricane Irma approaches the state. Officials at Walt Disney World in Orlando announced Friday afternoon that its parks will close on Saturday and remain closed through Monday. Universal Orlando announced on its website that it will close at 7 p.m. local time Saturday and will remain closed through Monday. Officials said they anticipate reopening on Tuesday. SeaWorld in Orlando and Busch Gardens, which is in Tampa, also announced plans to shut down at 5 p.m. local time Saturday and remain closed through Monday. Irma has weakened from a Category 5 storm to Category 4 but is still blowing at a life-threatening 250 km/h. There are fears as well that it may strengthen again as it enters warmer than normal waters around Florida. Cuba, Bahamas hit by Irma. The storm churned in the Atlantic and has started to last Cuba and the Bahamas as it charts its path towards Florida. The hurricane smashed homes, schools, stores, roads and boats on Wednesday and Thursday as it rolled over islands long known as turquoise water playgrounds of the rich, including St. Martin, St. Bart's, St. Thomas, Barbuda, and Anguilla. It knocked out power, water and telephone service, trapped thousands of tourists and stripped the lush green trees of leaves, leaving an eerie, blasted-looking landscape. Authorities reported looting and gunfire in St. Martin, and a curfew was imposed in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Meanwhile, the U.S. House voted to send a $15.3 billion $19 billion Australian dollars aid package for Hurricane Harvey victims in Texas through to U.S. President Donald Trump, which will extend U.S. borrowing and fund government through to December 8. Irma yesterday became the longest tropical cyclone in history to sustain wind speeds of 297 kilometers an hour. It is the most powerful Atlantic Ocean storm in recorded history. And yesterday, it was also twice the size of the entire Florida peninsula. Presidents band together to help, All 5 living former U.S. presidents have issued a joint One America appeal for donations to support the staggering recovery needs from Hurricane Harvey that hit Texas. Now that Hurricane Irma has damaged Puerto Rico and is closing in on Florida, the presidents are expanding the appeal to help its victims as well. A website for tax-deductible donations related to both storms is now live at oneamericaappeal.org. A special restricted account has been established through the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library Foundation to collect and quickly distribute donations to ensure 100 cents out of every dollar goes to assist hurricane victims. The Carter Center says Harvey has displaced more than 1 million people and caused an estimated $180 billion in damage over its 482-kilometer path of destruction. Some forecasters have predicted that Irma's economic toll could be even greater. Mr. Trump tweeted that he was proud to stand with past presidents. "We will confront any challenge, no matter how strong the winds or high the water. I'm proud to stand with presidents for #OneAmericaAppeal," he tweeted. $5.6 million asked to evacuate Florida ahead of Hurricane Irma. Roughly 1/4 of the nation's third-largest state has either been asked or ordered to evacuate, according to an official. Florida's hurricane program manager, Andrew Sussman, said at least 5.6 million people have been asked to flee the storm, according to the Associated Press. This includes residents ordered to evacuate in South Florida, as well as those who live in substandard housing inland. The report added, the state is home to some 21 million people, many of which have temporarily relocated to Georgia or other neighboring states ahead of Irma's severe impacts. So far, some 850,000 Floridians have been urged to leave their homes as Irma churns ever closer to the U.S. coastline. "Time is running out," said Florida Gov. Rick Scott during a Friday morning press conference. "Today is the day to do what's right for your family and get inland for safety." Scott has repeatedly warned residents to heed warnings, stressing that the sole focus is on life safety. "We are preparing for the storm aggressively. Every Floridian should take this seriously and be aggressive to protect their family," Scott said. Miami Beach Mayor Philip Levine echoed the governor. "Please leave Miami Beach," Levine said during an interview on the Weather Channel. "You don't want to be here. This is a barrier island. This hurricane, as I've said before, is a nuclear hurricane. Please leave. You have time today. We don't want heroes. We want living people." As residents departed Florida ahead of major Hurricane Irma, officials in Miami were taking no chances with its homeless population. According to the Associated Press, all of the estimated 1,100 homeless in the city were told to enter storm shelters or be detained and receive a mental health evaluation. They were using the Baker Act, a law that allows officials to institutionalize anyone who presents a danger to themselves or others, the AP also said. "We're going out and every single homeless person who is unwilling to come off the street, we are likely going to involuntarily Baker Act them," Ron Book, chairman of the Miami-Dade Homeless Trust, told the AP. At least 6 people were detained in such a manner by Friday afternoon, the report added. By law, they can be held for up to 72 hours before a court would have to allow their detention to be continued, the AP also said. President Donald Trump said Hurricane Irma is a storm of absolutely historic destructive potential, adding that his administration is doing all it can to help with disaster preparations, and the U.S. stands united to address the storm. Former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate was more direct in an interview with CNN. "Let me be blunt, anybody who didn't evacuate will drown. That's the risk." Here's the latest. Scott ordered evacuations in cities surrounding the southern half of Lake Okeechobee from Lakeport to Canal Point in Hendry, Palm Beach and Glades counties. The cities include Belglade, Canal Point, Lewiston, Lake Harbor, Moorhaven, Pahokee, and South Bay. Tampa ordered mandatory evacuations for all residents in Zone A, effective 2 p.m. Friday. Mandatory evacuations are underway in Pasco County for all residents living west of U.S. 19, and in Pinellas County, residents in the level evacuation zone are also evacuating. In Manatee County, evacuations in the level evacuation zone are now mandatory. In Sarasota County, a mandatory evacuation order was issued Thursday for residents living in Zone A. Florida's emergency management officials say nearly 6,000 people are already huddling in shelters across the state. All Florida public schools, state colleges and universities will remain closed through Monday. Florida State University announced it will remain closed through Tuesday. Scott asked gas stations to stay open as long as possible and said he would arrange for police escorts for employees to get out when needed. FEMA Director Brock Long said Friday 8,000 workers were being deployed to Florida. Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price declared a public health emergency in Florida Thursday, in addition to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Scott activated 7,000 members of the Florida National Guard Thursday to help with evacuations, sheltering and the aftermath of the storm. Scott has rescinded all weight and driver restrictions on the highways and also suspended all tolls for the duration of the storm's impacts to Florida so water, food, fuel and emergency supplies can be brought in quickly. Scott said Friday school buses will be made available to help cities evacuate. Throughout the state, residents are making one last run on water, gas and other essentials ahead of the storm, with shelves quickly emptying. Scott said they are moving fuel into the state to address gas shortages. He urged residents to only take as much fuel as necessary. Prison officials in Florida have been forced to conduct the largest evacuation of prisoners in state history, moving more than 7,000 inmates from work camps and community release centers to more secure facilities. Scott said he has asked all Florida hotels to waive pet restrictions as thousands flee. Walt Disney World in Orlando announced it would close for at least 2 days beginning Sunday. The U.S. Postal Service has suspended deliveries and retail operations in South Florida until further notice. Comcast has opened 137,000 Xfinity Wi-Fi hotspots across Florida to help people trying to evacuate. Street. Pete Clearwater International Airport closed 11 a.m. Friday, airport officials announced. Orlando International Airport will shut down 5 p.m. EDT Saturday and Ft. Lauderdale at 7:45 p.m. EDT Saturday. Miami International Airport will halt all flights Friday night. From Florida to Georgia, some 1.4 million people have been told to leave their homes. Hurricane Irma could hit Florida as a Category 5 storm. Almost 6 million people have been urged to evacuate across the U.S. states of Florida and Georgia as officials warn Hurricane Irma could regain strength and hit the state as a Category 5 storm, threatening the lives of anyone left in its path. Florida Governor Rick Scott told Southern Floridians to get out by midnight on Friday, local time, or to seek shelter nearby and hunker down. "We don't want anybody on these roads when the storm's coming through," he said. "We have shelters in your community. Go to those shelters. I mean, you go to your family, go to friends, go to those shelters. But we don't want people on the road when the storm starts to hit." The storm was downgraded to a Category 4 but could regain strength and hit Florida as a Category 5 hurricane, the most powerful designation by the National Hurricane Center, with sustained winds of 258 kilometers per hour. The United States has experienced only 3 Category 5 storms since 1851, and Irma is far larger than the last one to hit the country in 1992, Hurricane Andrew, according to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. "This is a storm that will kill you if you don't get out of the way," National Hurricane Center meteorologist and spokesman Dennis Feltgen said. Mr. Feltgen said the storm has a really wide eye, With hurricane force winds that cover the entire Florida peninsula and potentially deadly storm surges on both coasts. Everybody's going to feel this one, he said. The historic evacuation, including from areas around Miami, has been made more difficult by clogged highways, gasoline shortages and the challenge of moving older people. Interstates were clogged as far away as Atlanta as people fled the East Coast, with Mr. Scott telling residents that 1,700 Florida Highway Patrol people were working 12-hour shifts to help people evacuate. U.S. President Donald Trump said in a videotaped statement that Irma was a storm of absolutely historic destructive potential and called on people to heed recommendations from government officials and law enforcement. In Palm Beach, Mr. Trump's waterfront Mar-a-Lago estate was ordered evacuated. Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, said consular officials are continuing to make urgent inquiries to determine whether any Australians in the United States or Caribbean have been affected by Hurricane Irma or the earthquake in Mexico. DFAT is continuing to monitor the situation closely, it said, asking those concerned to contact family and friends in the region directly. Forecasters have repeatedly moved Irma's projected track a bit west because its long-anticipated turn north keeps getting pushed back. University of Miami researcher Brian McNulty said forecasters had expected a high-pressure system to weaken further north, allowing Irma to make the turn, but it is not weakening as fast as originally forecast. This has made it difficult for some residents to decide where they should evacuate to. On Thursday, when the forecast showed Irma coming up the coastline, Chatham County Emergency Management Director Dennis Jones had told people in Savannah to just move west. However, when Mr. Jones was asked again on Friday where residents should head after the National Hurricane Center moved its predicted storm track far inland into southern central Georgia, he could not give a location. "Honestly, I can't tell you where safe is," Mr. Jones replied. The governors of North and South Carolina warned residents to remain on guard even as the storm took a more westward track, saying their states still could experience severe weather, including heavy rain and flash flooding, early next week. Governor Terry McAuliffe has declared a state of emergency in Virginia so officials can better prepare for Hurricane Irma and help other affected states. In a statement, Governor McAuliffe said that while the track of Hurricane Irma is still uncertain, it appears increasingly likely that Virginia will see significant impacts. The whole state has been urged to prepare for possible flooding, high winds and storm surge. The U.S. Navy said they had 4 ships ready to assist with Hurricane Irma relief, including providing medical support, maritime security and logistical support. Thousands of Irma victims across the Caribbean are also desperately seeking shelter as another hurricane threatened to add to their misery. The death toll in the storm's wake across the Caribbean climbed to 22 as Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic and the eastern part of Cuba reported no major casualties or damage. But many others residents and tourists farther east were left reeling after the storm ravaged the islands, among them, St. Martin, St. Bart's, St. Thomas, Barbuda, and Anguilla. Many have fled their islands on ferries and fishing boats for fear of Hurricane Jose, a Category 4 storm with 241 km/h winds that could punish some places all over again over the weekend. "I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to know that further damage is imminent," Royal Police Force of Antigua and Barbuda Inspector Frankie Thomas said. Irma smashed homes, shops, roads and schools, knocked out power, water and telephone service, trapped thousands of tourists, and stripped trees of their leaves, leaving an eerie, blasted-looking landscape littered with sheet metal and splintered lumber. Hurricane Irma strengthened to a Category 5 storm late Friday as it made landfall in Cuba, forecasters said, on a path predicted to bring it to Florida and potentially causing catastrophic damage. Irma, with maximum sustained winds of 160 miles per hour, was making landfall on Cuba's Camaguey archipelago as of 11 p.m. ET, the National Hurricane Center said. The storm was around 300 miles southeast of Miami and is forecast to be near the Florida Keys by Sunday morning. But its effects on the Keys and in southwest Florida, which could include life-threatening storm surge, could be felt before then. Florida, first the Florida Keys, is going to be hit by a potentially devastating hurricane, and we're really very concerned, first for the Keys for storm surge, and then for the peninsula for storm surge along the coast, National Hurricane Center Acting Director Edward Rappaport said on MSNBC Friday. He said very strong winds and flooding rains were forecast to come ashore later Saturday and into Sunday. Florida Gov. Rick Scott on Friday warned people to leave the southern part of the state, and said that those not on the road by midnight should seek a nearby shelter. He said the storm is projected to be catastrophic. About 5.6 million people in Florida, more than 1/4 of the state's population, were ordered to evacuate and another 540,000 were told to leave the Georgia coast. The National Weather Service in Key West warned on Twitter Friday that nowhere in the Keys will be safe. "This is as real as it gets," the Weather Service said. President Donald Trump in a video message Friday warned this is a storm of absolutely historic destructive potential. He urged everyone in its path to heed evacuation orders. Florida Power and Light, the nation's third-largest electric utility, warned it was expecting unprecedented power outages. FPL CEO Eric Silagi said power outages could affect about 9 million people. The hurricane killed at least 23 people as it raked through the Caribbean earlier this week. The storm was a Category 5 with 160 miles per hour winds, faster than earlier Friday when it was a Category 4. On Cuba, thousands of tourists were evacuated from low-lying keys off the coast dotted with all-inclusive resorts ahead of the storm's approach. All residents of the area were under mandatory evacuation orders from the Cuban government, which was moving tens of thousands of people from vulnerable coastline. The hurricane ravaged small islands in the northeast Caribbean, including Barbuda, St. Martin and the British and U.S. Virgin Islands, ripping down trees and flattening homes and hospitals. The typically bustling downtowns of Miami, Fort Lauderdale and Naples were near empty Friday. Residents had either evacuated or were making last-minute preparations, resigned to sitting through the Category 5 hurricane in their homes and hoping for the best. Tony Marcellus struggled to figure out how to get his elderly mother and grandfather from their home near the ocean in West Palm Beach to his place in Atlanta, 600 miles away. Flights and rental cars were sold out, so he hired an Uber driver to take them 170 miles to meet him in Orlando. Manny Zuniga left his home in Miami at midnight Thursday and it still took him and his family 12 hours to get 230 miles to Orlando, a trip that normally takes 4 hours. "We're getting out of this state," he said, filling up the gas tank of his tightly packed SUV in Orlando. His final destination is a relative in Arkansas. "Irma is going to take all of Florida," he added. At least 900 flights were canceled in Florida as of Friday afternoon. Miami International Airport saw 75% of its schedule scrubbed. It will remain open but no flights are expected to arrive or depart on Saturday or Sunday. Gas supplies were put under strain. According to Gas Buddy, 38% of gas stations in Miami, Fort Lauderdale are out of fuel and 55% of Gainesville stations were depleted. In response to the shortages, Scott directed Florida Highway Patrol to escort resupply trucks to gas stations. There are currently 1,700 members of Florida Highway Patrol working the roadways on 12-hour shifts, Scott said. The U.S. Navy on Friday ordered an aircraft carrier and 2 other ships to get underway to be in position to provide humanitarian and search assistance if necessary. A 4th ship conducting local operations was ordered to join the group, the Navy said. Georgia was also preparing for the hurricane effects of Irma. Gov. Nathan Deal announced mandatory evacuations to go into effect Saturday at 8 a.m. ET for certain low-lying parts in the state's south. Even as forecasts showed the storm center could enter Georgia far inland, Deal urged nearly 540,000 coastal residents to flee, noting Irma's path remains unpredictable. Forecasts show it could enter the state Monday anywhere from the Atlantic coast to the Alabama state line. Meanwhile, Hurricane Jose shadowed Irma's movements, strengthening to a Category 4 storm on Friday with walloping winds of 150 miles per hour, according to the National Hurricane Center. Jose has brought another hurricane watch to Antigua, Barbuda, and Anguilla, and St. Martin only 2 days after the islands in the region were damaged by Irma. Hurricane Irma's projected path shifts, showing greater threat to west coast of Florida. A forecast for Hurricane Irma has shifted the trajectory of the megastorm slightly westward, which may mean direct hits on the Florida Keys and worst-case scenarios for the cities of Naples, Fort Myers and possibly Tampa. As of late Friday East Coast time, modeling from the NBC Weather Unit now expects catastrophic wind and storm damage in the Keys early Sunday morning. Marco Island, Naples, Cape Coral and Fort Myers are likely to be struck later on Sunday. A shift west would still mean that the east coast of Florida sees hurricane gusts and damage, NBC said, but it makes catastrophic effects less likely from Miami northwards. Strengthens back to Category 5. Irma, one of the most powerful Atlantic storms in a century, strengthened and made landfall on an island chain in Cuba as a Category 5 storm, according to a late Friday night tweet from the U.S. National Hurricane Center, NHC. The NHC also extended hurricane warnings northward along the Florida peninsula. Earlier on Friday, the extremely dangerous hurricane was downgraded from a Category 5 to a Category 4, but it still packed winds as strong as 155 miles per hour at that time, the NHC said in an advisory. Irma has already lashed the Caribbean with devastating winds and torrential rain, leaving behind at least 21 deaths and a swath of destruction. Dozens of cities and counties in increasingly northern regions of Florida are issuing mandatory evacuations that have affected millions of residents. Some highways have ground to a halt from congestion as evacuees flee the most dangerous hurricane areas. Florida Governor Rick Scott is scheduled to deliver an update on the storm on Saturday morning from Sarasota. A mandatory evacuation on Georgia's Atlantic coast was due to begin on Saturday, Governor Nathan Deal said. Hurricane Irma lashed Cuba and the Bahamas as it drove toward Florida on Saturday after hitting the eastern Caribbean with its devastatingly high winds, killing 21 people and leaving catastrophic destruction in its wake. It made landfall on Cuba late on Friday night as a Category 5 storm, striking the Camaguey Archipelago with 160 miles per hour, 260 kilometers per hour, winds. Shortly before midnight local time, 5 a.m. UK, Irma was about 300 miles, 485 kilometers, southeast of Miami. As many as 5.6 million people were told to evacuate from Florida, more than a quarter of the state's population. At least 540,000 people in parts of Georgia were also told to flee as the storm headed towards the American mainland. "This is a storm that will kill you if you don't get out of the way," said National Hurricane Center meteorologist and spokesman Dennis Feltgen. Feltgen said the storm has a really wide eye, with hurricane-force winds that cover the entire Florida peninsula and potentially deadly storm surges on both coasts. Tom Bossert, U.S. Homeland Security Advisor, said, "Please listen to your local authorities. You need to evacuate from south to north. That is a staggered and carefully thought-out process. There will come a point where you are on your own." In West Palm Beach, police are going door to door, urging people to obey the mandatory evacuation order. Rick Scott, the governor of Florida, said they were working to ensure that fuel was available for cars to get to shelters. He told people they should not wait, and should leave now. Irma claimed its first victim in Florida, even before making landfall, when a 57-year-old man fell from a ladder while fitting storm shutters at his home. The RAF has sent several aid planes to the region after the British territory of the Turks and Caicos Islands was pummeled by howling winds of up to 175 miles per hour and 20 feet waves early on Friday. Irma is now tracking a path down the coast of Cuba towards the Bahamas, where it is due to reach early on Saturday, before hitting southern Florida early on Sunday. Florida's major theme parks, including Walt Disney World, Universal, and SeaWorld, will remain closed throughout the weekend. The U.S. military was on Friday night mobilizing thousands of troops and deploying several large ships to aid with evacuations and humanitarian relief, as the Air Force removed scores of planes from the region. Meanwhile, extra troops were sent to the devastated holiday island of St. Martin on Friday to control serious looting, as 3 RAF planes began ferrying troops and equipment to hard-hit British territories. UK Marines have also arrived on Anguilla to begin repairing buildings. As Irma cuts through the Caribbean, 2 other storms in the region have been upgraded to hurricane status, Kacha in the Gulf of Mexico and Jose, which is following Irma in the Atlantic and has made landfall in eastern Mexico. However, it had weakened to a Category 1 storm. The Red Cross said an estimated 1.2 million people have already been affected by Irma, and that figure could rise sharply to 26 million, amid fears disease could spread in areas where drinking water and sanitation services have broken down. U.S. President Donald Trump said in a videotaped statement that Irma was a storm of absolutely historic destructive potential and called on people to heed recommendations from government officials and law enforcement. In Palm Beach, Trump's waterfront Mar-a-Lago estate was ordered evacuated, but strikes by 4 previous hurricanes did little damage to the facility in the 90 years since serial heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post and her second husband, Financier F. Hutton, built the 126-room, 62,500 square foot, 5,800 square meter, estate in Palm Beach. The mansion's walls are 3 feet, 1 meter, thick, anchored by steel and concrete beams embedded into coral rock. An estimated 400,000 Britons live in Florida. They and thousands of tourists are being supported by David Prodger, the UK's Consul General, with a team of staff deployed at Miami Airport helping people to get home. Hurricane Irma strengthens, hits Cuba on its way to Florida. Hurricane Irma hit northern Cuba during its long, destructive march toward Florida, where it's expected to hammer the state with whistling winds, heavy rain and surging seas. Florida authorities went door-to-door warning residents of the massive hurricane, sending crowds jamming highways as they fled north. The powerful Category 5 storm had maximum sustained winds of 160 miles per hour when it made landfall on Cuba's Camaguey archipelago, the National Hurricane Center said late Friday. It edged closer to South Florida after killing 24 people in the Caribbean this week, and strengthened to a Category 5 storm in Cuba. Hours earlier Friday, it was a Category 4. Irma is expected to be near the Florida Keys and South Florida by early Sunday, and many residents there have moved inland. About 5.6 million people in the state have been ordered to evacuate, Governor Rick Scott said. Forecasters and Florida officials sent dire warnings imploring residents on the path of the storm to evacuate and escape Irma's wrath. If you have been ordered to evacuate, leave now. Not tonight, not in an hour, now, Scott said Friday night. Staying in homes could subject residents to storm surges high as 12 feet, the governor added. Here are the latest developments. Irma's center was about 85 miles east of Camaguey, Cuba, on Saturday morning. It appears Miami will avoid a direct hit but will still get pounded by strong winds, storm surge and heavy rains. Irma's center will move near the north coast of Cuba on Saturday, near the Florida Keys on Sunday morning, and near the southwest coast of Florida on Sunday afternoon, the National Weather Service said. Before Irma hit Cuba, it had slammed the Turks and Caicos, and southeastern Bahamas. In the Caribbean, hard hit Barbuda and St. Martin Islands wearily prepared for Hurricane Jose, which could hit there over the weekend. The Red Cross said as many as 26 million people could be exposed to destructive winds and torrential rain just in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Cuba. It said 1.2 million people have been battered by the storm. At its peak, a then Category 5 Irma sustained maximum wind speeds of at least 185 miles per hour for longer, 37 hours, than any storm on record. Of the 24 deaths blamed on Irma, 9 were in unspecified French territories, 1 on Barbuda, 1 at the British Overseas Territory of Anguilla, 2 in Dutch-administered St. Martin, 4 in the British Virgin Islands, 4 on the U.S. Virgin Islands, and 3 in Puerto Rico. Hurricane warnings are in effect for parts of central Cuba, and the southeastern, central and northwestern Bahamas. Hurricane warnings also are in effect from Sebastian Inlet on the east coast, southward around the Florida Peninsula to Ana Maria Island on the Panhandle. The warning includes the Keys, Lake Okeechobee, and Florida Bay. Tracking Hurricane Irma's path. Irma could overwhelm parts of the Bahamas, a nation of about 390,000, with storm surges of up to 20 feet, well above the island's elevation, CNN meteorologist Chad Myers said. Irma brought heavy rain and powerful winds to the low-lying Turks and Caicos Islands. The capital island of Grand Turk suffered quite a bit of damage, including to part of a hospital's roof, Governor John Freeman told CNN. Nervous Florida waits. U.S. and European forecast models predicted the eye could strike the Florida Keys and then the Everglades, west of Miami, on Saturday night into Sunday morning. It's not a question of whether Florida is going to be impacted, it's a question of how bad Florida is going to be impacted, Federal Emergency Management Agency Administrator Brock Long said. Ahead of the game, Florida seniors, nursing homes prep for Hurricane Irma. Though the core has the most power, Irma is huge. Its winds of at least tropical storm force cover 70,000 square miles, larger than the area of Florida, 65,000 square miles. Florida is not the only state preparing for possible impact. FEMA said Alabama and North Carolina should watch the storm. South Carolina Gov. Henry McMaster issued a mandatory evacuation for Saturday for some barrier islands, while Georgia Gov. Nathan Deal expanded the state of emergency to include a total of 94 counties. After Irma, Hurricane Jose looms. The Caribbean islands pummeled by Irma are assessing the damage. Shredded buildings, battered cars and streets submerged in water are a common sight. Barbuda, one of 2 major islands in the nation of Antigua and Barbuda, is barely habitable, with about 95% of its buildings damaged, Prime Minister Gaston Brown said. Brown estimated the damage will cost $100 million to fix on the island of 1,800 residents. Anguilla, Barbuda, St. Martin and St. Barts are under a hurricane warning for Hurricane Jose, which could pass close to those islands Saturday. The government called for voluntary evacuations from Barbuda, Brown said. Hurricane season hasn't peaked yet. Here's what to expect. Cabaret, Haiti. Hurricane Jose, a powerhouse tropical cyclone barreling northwest toward the Caribbean islands hammered by Hurricane Irma earlier this week, is now almost a Category 5 storm, officials said late Friday. The National Hurricane Center at 11 a.m. Friday said that Jose had reached maximum sustained wind speeds of 155 miles per hour, which would be just shy of a Category 5 storm. A bulletin from the center at 2 a.m. Eastern Time Saturday indicated Jose's maximum wind speed decreased slightly to 150 miles per hour, with some gusts blowing even higher. Though still a Category 4 system, some fluctuation in intensity, up or down, could occur during the next 24 hours, forecasters said. A hurricane warning is in effect for Barbuda, Anguilla, St. Martin and St. Barthélemy, also known as St. Barts. The island of Antigua is under a hurricane watch. Once it passes the northern Leeward Islands, Jose is projected to hook north and steadily lose muscle. It will, however, likely throw off tropical storm strength weather felt Saturday night in the British and U.S. Virgin Islands, which also sustained heavy damage during Irma. The alarming announcement comes as military personnel and emergency responders from the United States and Europe rushed to aid those still reeling from Irma, which roared across the same region as a Category 5 storm Wednesday. On the devastated island of Barbuda, authorities and private tour operators scrambled to evacuate the remainder of its 1,600 residents, taking them to emergency shelters on nearby Antigua. Michael Joseph, president of the Red Cross in Antigua and Barbuda, described Barbuda as though it were a tropical ghost town of broken buildings,